In December of 2025, A'ja Wilson sat down with Time magazine as the most decorated active player in WNBA history. For MVPs, 3 champs, she had just produced one of the greatest individual seasons professional basketball had ever seen. And then she said one word that split the sport in half. She said Caitlin Clark's arrival had erased one history. Not overshadowed it, erased it. Within hours, every corner of women's basketball was on fire. Tonight, we are going inside that word, what Wilson actually meant, what Clark's numbers actually prove, and why the truth of this debate is more complicated than either side wants to admit. Point one word. 2 leagues to understand why Wilson's words landed with the force they did. You first have to understand the moment they arrived. It was December of 2025. The 1B season had concluded. The Las Vegas Aces had just completed a sweep of the 2025 1B Finals, with Wilson claiming her 3rd championship title and becoming the first player in either the WNBA or the NBA to win a scoring title, a championship, Finals MVP.
The 2020 WNBA MVP award to A'ja Wilson.
She had just produced one of the greatest individual seasons professional basketball had ever seen. And then she said one word that split the sport in half. She said Caitlin
League MVP and Defensive Player of the Year in the same season. By any measurable standard, Wilson had just produced one of the greatest individual seasons in the history of professional basketball. She had earned every word of every tribute being written about her, and Time magazine named her 2025 Athlete of the Year, the feature article that accompanied. That honor, written by Sean Gregory, contained the line that changed everything. Gregory provided context, noting that Clark's rookie season in 2024 had helped the WNBA hit milestone television and attendance figures, and that Clark's emergence had created what he described as a toxic, racially divisive narrative, suggesting she was almost singularly responsible for saving a league whose foundation had been built by a mostly Black player base. Within that context, Wilson spoke. She said the narrative was not a hit at her personally, that her resume was secure, her medals were real, her MVP trophies were hers. But then she said it. The history, she said, was erased for a minute, and she said she did not like that. The word erased is doing enormous.
WNBA champion, a dynasty in the desert, the Las Vegas Aces.
Work in that sentence. IT is not a subtle word. IT does not hedge. IT does not leave room for multiple interpretations. It makes a specific declarative claim that something which existed was made to not exist by the force of Clark's arrival and the way the media chose to cover it. Wilson was not accusing Clark herself of anything. She was accusing a narrative, a media-driven story, of committing an act of historical deletion. But in the environment of 2025, women's basketball, where the relationship between Clark's fan base and the broader WNBA community had been electrically charged since Clark's first professional game, the distinction between the player and the narrative dissolved almost immediately. Within hours of the article's publication, Wilson's quote was everywhere. Fan accounts dissected it word by word. Sports media took sides. Former players weighed in. Clark supporters called it an attack. Wilson supporters called it a long overdue truth. The comment section of every WNBA-adjacent post on social media became a war zone. And at the center of all of it was a question that nobody could quite agree on. Was A'ja Wilson right? It is worth pausing on the specific.
As we all know, Caitlin Clark has changed the face of the WNBA.
Architecture of Wilson's statement. She did not say Clark was undeserving of her recognition. She did not attack Clark's talent, Clark's work ethic, or Clark's character. She located the problem in a narrative, in the way the story of Clark's arrival was being told by media, by sponsors, and by the broader cultural conversation that surrounded the WNBA's unprecedented growth in 2024. The target was a story, not a person, but in the environment that women's basketball had become by December of 2025, the distinction between the story and the person at its center had essentially collapsed. When Wilson criticized the narrative, large portions of the public heard it as a criticism of Clark, and the reaction that followed was shaped almost entirely by that misreading. To fully understand what Wilson was pushing back against, you have to understand what the media landscape around the WNBA looked like throughout 2024. Every major sports outlet in America covered Clark's rookie season with an intensity that had never been applied to women's professional basketball before. That coverage was, in many ways, deserved.
The WNBA Finals, A'ja Wilson has been named the 2022 WNBA MVP.
The numbers Clark was producing and the audiences she was drawing were genuinely historic, but the framing of the coverage frequently implied that the WNBA was discovering something for the first time rather than scaling. Something that had been built over nearly 3 decades. Phrases like saving the league and rescuing women's basketball. The distinction sounds small. To the players who spent their careers building that league before anyone was watching, it was enormous. What exactly does it mean for history to be erased? And is that what actually happened? When Caitlin Clark arrived in the WNBA, A'ja Wilson was not talking about herself. Before this video goes any further, something needs to be said clearly. A'ja Wilson's career is not a footnote. IT is not a supporting story. It is one of the most extraordinary athletic biographies in the history of women's professional sports. And any honest of this debate has to start by acknowledging that fully. Wilson was the first overall pick in the 2018 WNBA draft. She arrived in Las Vegas and immediately transformed a franchise that had never won a championship into, and led the Aces to their first championship title in franchise history. And 2023, she repeated as champion and...
Clark, wow! You got from beyond the logo!
Won Finals MVP. By the time Clark entered the league, Wilson had already achieved things that players spend entire careers chasing and never reach. She was, by every legitimate metric, the best player in the WNBA, and yet in 2024, the year Wilson won her 3rd MVP award and her 2nd Olympic gold medal in Paris, where she was named tournament MVP, the vast majority of WNBA media coverage was consumed by a single story, a rookie from Iowa. The television cameras followed. Clark everywhere. The attendance records being broken were being attributed to Clark. The sponsors were circling Clark. The cultural conversation was Clark. Wilson won the MVP. Clark was on the magazine covers. The players who preceded Clark. The Diana Taurasi's, the Sue Birds, the Simone Augustuses, the Tamika Catchingsaws had spent decades building the WNBA into something sustainable, something that could survive the low ratings and the small arenas and the constant media indifference. They had done it with almost none of the platform that Clark arrived with. They had done it quietly, persistently in buildings that were sometimes half empty for salaries that required overseas contracts to supplement the foundation that Clark was now standing on. The infrastructure, the professionalism, the quality of play had been constructed by those women year after year, without the world watching. Wilson's argument, in its most generous interpretation, is simply this. Do not rewrite the story of the WNBA's growth as if it began in 2024. Do not erase the names and the work and the sacrifice that made Clark's arrival possible. That is a legitimate argument. IT is historically accurate, and it deserves to be heard seriously, rather than dismissed as jealousy, a word that was thrown at Wilson repeatedly in the days following the Time article, and that she had directly and firmly rejected as early as 2024. Can a person be the greatest active player in their sport and still feel that the story being told about their sport does not adequately credit the people who built it? The answer to that question is obviously yes, and understanding that yes is essential to understanding what Wilson was actually saying. The WNBA was founded in 1997, for the first 2.5 decades of its existence. The league survived on a combination of genuine athletic excellence and institutional determination. In the face of chronic media underinvestment, the players who built the league, Cynthia Cooper, Lisa Leslie, Cheryl Swoops, Lauren Jackson, Diana Torres, Sue Bird, Maya Moore, Candace Parker, did so without the benefit of viral social media moments, without the backing of major sports media ecosystems, and without the attendance figures that Clark's arrival eventually helped generate. They played in arenas that were sometimes a third full. They earned salaries that required them to spend their off-seasons playing in Europe or Asia just to make professional basketball financially sustainable. They did all of this not because the rewards were great, but because the sport was worth fighting for. In over 27 years, their collective effort produced something real. A professional league with genuine competitive quality, a growing global player base, and a culture of excellence that provided the foundation for everything that followed. Wilson was drafted into that culture. She understood it from the inside. She knew what it cost the generations before her, and when she watched the 2024 media narrative imply that the WNBA story effectively began with a rookie from Iowa, the reaction she described, a quiet, private refusal to accept. That framing was the reaction of someone who had inherited a legacy and felt it's her personally, not as a threat to herself, as an injustice to the women whose sacrifices she had witnessed and benefited from directly. The numbers don't need a narrative now. The Indiana Fever, a franchise that had recorded one of the worst records in the league